It's great to be joined today by Douglas Lain, who's the publisher of the critical theory imprint Zero Books, a podcaster and YouTuber, and the author of several novels. Most recently, his critically acclaimed novel, Bash Bash Revolution, which came out in March of this year, which we will get to. It's so great to have you on. You know, you, like we, have been following the pseudo-intellectualism movement that has really become extraordinarily popular over the last several years. And I think it's important to understand the movement, to go back beyond just the last sort of several years. Where do you really pinpoint as the sort of origin of what we now see as pseudo-intellectualism? Like, how far back does this phenomena go?
Oh, well, I mean, if you want to go all the way back, it goes to the pre-Socratic, rhetoricians, the sophists, if people who think that arguments sounding good and being rhetorically effective are better or just as good anyway as sound arguments. But as far as the new kind of classical liberal anti-social justice warrior movement with people like Dave Rubin and Jordan Peterson and even Sam Harris to a degree, it's really tough to say. For me, actually, when that exactly started, certainly before the election of Trump, there's been a move to critique the left as being regressive, to critique the left as allergic to debate. And sometimes that's not entirely wrong.
Sure.
But the problem is that by becoming victims themselves of this regressive left, they've stopped being interested in actually having those debates and are just sort of scoring easy points off of these incidents where young leftists usually, or academics, will, duck out of debate or claim to that rigorous debate would be offensive or something. And so they do the same thing, but in reverse. But yeah, I would say that 2014 might be the beginning, somewhere around there, where you start to see this building up of a what I'll just call an anti-intellectual right, but that, or an anti-social justice warrior right, certainly.
One of the things I've experienced when talking about this is I will sometimes, and you mentioned some names, and I now am increasingly careful not to, unless I'm offering sort of like a specific criticism of a particular idea, because most of the feedback I get from the audience is basically arguing about whether the specific individuals I mentioned are or aren't intellectuals. And I feel that that's actually a distraction from what the issue really is. I'm more concerned with the pseudo-intellectualism of the movement that has been built around the individuals and less so about the sort of intellectual credentials of any one particular person. I'm curious whether you agree or whether you think the focus actually should be on the intellectual credentials of any particular individual.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And actually, I'm not doubting the credentials of, say, Jordan Peterson, right? I mean, he's a professor. He's a clinical psychologist. He has his level of expertise. I'm sure he's more educated about Jungian psychology than I am, and I don't want to impugn his reputation as a professor. I think anyone who is a public intellectual might be tempted to kind of become a pseudo-intellectual because the market drives you to simplify your message, to find what communicates well, and to placate and comfort your audience. So whenever you're not looking at difficult questions or avoiding debates, either internally or with a foe, an ideological opponent, you're probably engaging in some sort of pseudo-intellectualism. You're probably using rhetorical arguments when you should be, thinking.
I've made the analogy that some of what makes these pseudo-intellectual ideas appealing to individuals who sort of follow them and start to espouse and parrot them is similar to what makes conspiracy theories appealing to people sometimes, which is that there is some way in which having a seemingly straightforward and supposedly objective explanation of how and why something happened or how and why something is the way that it is is in a way more comforting than acknowledging the significant gray area that exists in most areas of sort of human existence as a species on our planet. And while, of course, the pseudo-intellectualism stuff is not conspiracy theories, I'm not saying that, that some of the psychology underlying its appeal has crossover. What do you think of that? Do you think there's something there?
I think that, yeah, absolutely. I think that actually one of the common traits of, I like to call them the antisocial justice warrior uh, personalities. They're part of an industry, a media industry that's risen up. One of the common tropes is this trope that the difficulties that we are experiencing, say, in our family life, and the family in America is in crisis, that this is due to bad actors. This is due to, like, say, for instance, hysterical feminists. And then that movement itself is due to a conspiracy by Marxists to undermine Western civilization. So you
And
can find
don't forget postmodernists as well.
right. Well, postmodernism, right, as well, which is again just a cover ideology for the true evil of Marxism. I happen to be what I call a wannabe Marxist, which means that I've read Marx. I'm struggling to understand his work as deeply as I can, and I do think that he has a very powerful critique of capitalism and the structure of our society around class lines. So I am particularly interested in and kind of combating this conspiracy theory in the antisocial justice warrior industry. For me, that's the most important thing that they're doing, and that's for two reasons. One is that it's wrong and it's red baiting and it needs to be combated. But the other reason is that because every time they do that, it gives a Marxist like myself an opportunity to correct them and to talk about what Marx actually wrote and to kind of push my own propaganda there. So,
and I think that's an interesting example, actually, because one of the sort of trends that I'm seeing is that this movement, however it is that we describe it and whatever borders we sort of assign to it, is actually very effective at creating no-win situations for their would-be opponents, in the sense that they set up scenarios where if I, as someone on the left, for example, say, listen, there is an anti-free speech element on the left, but I think that it's very small. I'm immediately interrupted and it's, oh, so you admit that it exists, right? And then that's sort of where the conversation follows, and it appears as sort of some pseudo vindication. The only other way is to sort of deny that there's any element of truth to it, which is not actually authentically what I think. And they've really set it up very well to be able to say, either way, whether you accept that they're right or whether you deny it, you fall into this sort of caricature of what they're criticizing. And I wonder if you have any idea how to sort of circumvent that.
I don't know. The only I can think of doing is trying to get them to live up to their own rhetoric and propaganda and the way that their own self-conception. Jordan Peterson can be quite eloquent about defending free speech and how important it is to be able to articulate ideas and talk together in public to figure out what we should do as a society. And he's not wrong. I mean, when he talks about that, he's compelling. But he doesn't do it. And I want to give you my own particular example.
Yeah, I know about this, and I think it'll be interesting.
Yeah. So back in December of last year, I emailed Jordan Peterson's publicist and asked for an interview with Peterson, telling them that we were a critical theory imprint out of the UK and that I wanted to discuss Nietzsche and Marx with him. And I gave him a few other details. I gave her, his publicist, a few other details. They gave me a date. They said, sure, let's make this happen right around the time when his book is coming out. So I had it down for January 24th. I was very excited. I announced it on Facebook and on Twitter and all of that. And I have to say, there were elements of the left, people who I knew and people who at least I knew of, who were very critical of me for even giving Peterson a platform. But I insisted, that we had to, engage with the right, that we couldn't just think that we could socially shame or deplatform away bad ideas and that we should engage them. So this was scheduled. His team canceled right after or right around the time that the Kathy Newman interview happened. And that the reason they canceled was because after that Kathy Newman interview, in which, by the way, I think she did a particularly poor job of engaging him because she misrepresented his ideas in real time. I mean, not that his ideas are great, but you don't have to misrepresent them. You just have to engage them. But in any case, they canceled. And shortly after that, they promised to reschedule, but they canceled. Shortly after that, he went on Joe Rogan and said no Marxist would ever debate him. Rogan asked him, have you ever talked to these crazy people? Have you ever heard their side of the story? What do they say? And he said, well, no, they don't debate me. They don't want to debate me. They never asked me. And that was when I decided, well, wait a minute, I have to intervene somehow. So I started tweeting at him and saying, hey, we have an interview planned. You're not telling the truth. Rule 8. What about Rule 8? Always speak the truth. I mean, let me correct you. I know you might be mistaken here, but so then his team shortly after that, not too long after that, just canceled altogether, saying there would never be a time for us to talk. And so now I don't know if that was in response to my tweets. I would tend to think not. I just tend to think, he was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he started going on his world tour, and they just cleared the board of all the smaller shows. So, but in any case, I said, hey, wait, we had an agreement before. This isn't like a new request. You're treating this like it's a new request, but they didn't write back to me. And then recently on Reddit, he did this Ask Me Anything. I'm not exactly sure what to call it, but people have to submit questions to Reddit, and he responded on Reddit. And one of the questions they asked was, why are you ducking Douglas Lain? Why haven't you debated Douglas Lain? You say no Marxist wants to debate you, but he invited you on his show and you canceled. So how can you say that? And he gave a kind of angry response. It's like, I'm not obligated to talk to just anybody who asks. And, I don't know who Douglas Lain is, and I never heard about this. And so, okay. So he didn't hear about it from his publicist. I believe that. And he's not obligated to talk to me. But now, by his own rule, he is obligated to stop saying that no Marxists want to debate him. And I'm going to be watching to see if he continues to say that. If I had the resources, I'd make a little movie like Roger and Me with Jordan Peterson. I just follow him trying to get that interview and make when Michael Moore chased down the head of General Motors,
yes,
trying
of course,
to talk to him. So I would do that with Peterson if I had the resources, but I don't. I have too many other things to do. But I will pursue him on social media, I guess, and try to hold him to his own Rule 8, which is always tell the truth. And now we know that he knows that there's a Marxist who wants to debate him.
Let's pause our conversation there. We're speaking with Douglas Lain, and we are going to continue the conversation with him on tomorrow's program. We're continuing our conversation with Douglas Lain. He's the publisher of the critical theory imprint Zero Books, podcaster, YouTuber, author of several novels, including most recently Bash Bash Revolution, which we will get to shortly. Douglas, what's your sense of when it comes to fighting pseudo-intellectualism, and not necessarily the individuals, but the ideas? What's the best way to engage some of the people that hear one of these pseudo-intellectual memes and then they start to integrate it into their sort of normal repertoire of debate and discussion? What's the best way to take the ideas head on and challenge them?
I happen to bring a prop to answer that question. And this is Christopher Lash's book, The Culture of Narcissism. And what I think the best way to go about combating someone like Peterson is to, first of all, point out that there are left critics who make similar but not identical arguments to his that we should engage with and that we should take on and talk about. And I think Christopher Lash would be that kind of critic. I mean, he was writing in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and he's long dead now. But a lot of what he said about the crisis of the family and his critiques of liberal modernity and his concerns about American culture kind of are echoed in Peterson's talk. And I mean, Peterson's a much more shallow thinker, and that's why it's a good idea to point out that not only can we engage with Peterson, but we have our own critics of these phenomena, these problems. And so that's what I would suggest people do, is pick up
Doesn't that run the risk? I'm curious whether that runs the risk of, Peterson likes to insist that he is not an alt-right guy and that his ideas are not fundamentally right-wing ideas. And that's one of the defenses he uses actually when he's critiqued. Doesn't that risk allowing him to get away with that even more when it's often sort of a distortion in terms of the solutions? Because I feel like you're right that there are lots of other people on left and right who identify similar problems to the ones he identifies, but the solutions is often where there's a difference.
Well, I'm not sure about how important it is to peg him as alt-right.
Yeah, I don't think it is that important, but it's because it's often a topic of discussion, I guess I bring it up.
Yeah. I mean, I think that more important than pegging him as alt-right is to create a situation where his ideas are not the only ones out there and not the only ones resonating with people who might be feeling pressures around, say, employment or family trouble or coming of age. I mean, I think that's a very big part of his appeal, is that you've got young men in particular who are having difficulties maybe finding a job and certainly finding themselves as they transition from being kids to adults. And Peterson's giving them not only a way to try to think about doing that, but also people to blame for their own problems. And if you can give them a way to understand their situation that's a little deeper, that might cut against his appeal. So I like developing our own critiques, putting forward our own ideas, and being willing to take on difficulties within our own ideology. I think there really are some problems on the left right now. The fact that Trump won is not just a symptom of how bad the Rust Belt is or how bad certain segments of Americans are, but also how there's a crisis in liberal politics, and we've lost our way to an extent, and we need to rediscover our mission, I think. And
those alternatives need to be eloquent, though, right? I mean, a lot of it is packaging and PR and presentation. And so even if we identify competing ideas or similar critiques that maybe approach solutions differently, you need someone who can do what Peterson does as well.
Well, that's you, right?
Right.
You've got this show.
Right.
You've got
no,
this,
but seriously, I mean,
platform.
there's a cult of personality element to it that should not be understated.
Yeah, okay. That's true. And I don't know exactly what to do about that. And the thing about that is that doesn't just happen on the right. And it doesn't happen quite as often on, for liberal political shows, like say this one or the Majority Report. No one's doing, setting up an altar to Sam Seder, right? But it does happen online. It happens to anyone who comes along and says, "Hey, I have a way for you to make sense of your life." And I think of Peterson in particular as being kind of a similar character to Terence McKenna, who was totally different ideologically, but it had a similar kind of appeal to people because they could turn to McKenna, who had some wild ideas, crazy ideas, but he also spoke well and developed a little cult of personality around himself, and it's like a pop star. They also they develop fan bases, right? So I'm not sure how to deal with that exactly. I know that we do it sometimes on the left. I mean, Noam Chomsky is a hero to a lot of people. He's this unlikely pop star. So yeah, I don't know exactly what to do about that. I mean, just don't be too allergic to it, but be aware of the problem.
Let's talk a little bit, if we can, to talk about, to go from a real life dystopia maybe to one that's pseudo-fictional, I guess. Your latest book, Bash Bash Revolution. It is dystopian. It relates to AI.
Should I hold that one up too?
Sure, by all means. Yeah, tell us a little bit. I mean, how do you describe the book?
Sorry, I lost you there. I hit
No
the.
problem.
Could
So
you say that
I
again?
mean, how did you conceive of the book? How did you describe? How would you describe the book to people?
Well, okay. So the book was written for two reasons. One is that my son is very good at Super Smash Brothers Melee. He's in college now, but when I started it out, he was younger, and he could always beat me at Super Smash Brothers Melee. So I decided I want to write a novel that was like a wish fulfillment novel where the middle-aged dad could win. And the only way I could think of doing it is that he would get help from an AI. So that was part of the reason I wrote the book. But that's not actually the major plot point in the book. Um, it's about trying to conceive of a way to overcome capitalism. And it's sort of a thought experiment novel where I set up a situation where, with help from a artificial intelligence, a gang of gamers save the world by overcoming capitalism, but along the way lose their identities and lose their sense of connectedness. And one of them, the main character, it starts out the novel resisting being part of the new economy, the revolution, but what's called the GameCube economy. And so it's written from this point of view of a dissenter against the very thing that's stopping society from being destroyed by the Trump administration and the nuclear Armageddon and all of that. So that's the plot of, and that's some summary of Bash Bash Revolution.
So this is like a very practical question, but I've not yet gotten a good answer to it. And since you're in the genre, maybe you can tell me. What is the difference between accessible science fiction and young adult science fiction?
I don't know. My book has been marketed as young adult, but I didn't write it with that aim. It does have a teenage protagonist. I'm not put off by that, but it is interesting to me that that's where it ended up. I guess, really, I think the difference is just marketing. I think that, and also maybe, like I said, maybe it's just whether or not there are young characters that, protagonists that dominate the story. That might be all it is. But I do know that there are people in the genre who really focus on writing young adult novels that are thoughtful and interesting and aimed specifically at those readers. And I didn't do that, but I ended up in that category.
Present company aside, of course, what's your assessment of the science fiction world right now? I mean, it's very easy to just say, hey, listen, the greats are in the past and this is not the best time for science fiction. But, anybody can just say that. I mean, when you really think about it, like, what do you think about the current era of science fiction?
Well, I don't know. I think the greats are in the past. And no, I like a number of writers who are working today. And I think it's really exciting when people who I've known, maybe not well, but I've known of and who we've met at conventions and things, succeed. And so I'm a little jealous of people like Jeff Vandermeer and Ted Chiang, who had movies made of their work and have had big work. And I would say that in a lot of ways that the science fiction writing that's going on today is more significant in the overall culture than it ever has been, because it has bled well into the mainstream of our culture. So something like Stranger Things, that's a science fiction story, right? I mean, that's all that is, and it was a huge phenomenon, and you didn't have to be a nerd to be into it. So I think science fiction is bigger than ever. As terms of like short story writing and even novel writing, the whole realm of publishing is changing so much that it's difficult to say where the center is anymore. You don't have one set of writers who everyone knows anymore. There are a few that a lot of people know, like Vandermeer, but there's no center anymore. It's all niched out and kind of micro targeted. And so the other thing is I was going to science fiction conventions and really participating in that culture a lot about a decade ago. And a couple of years back now, in 2015, I was nominated for a science fiction award called the Philip K. Dick Award. So I went to a convention again. And then when I was there, I realized, I haven't been to a convention in a very long time. No, I know no one here. So it's, yeah, I don't know if that's just speaks to me or something's changing in the science fiction world, because I could still write science fiction and not participate in that culture as much. And it may mean, I think, but I don't know, that it may mean that that sort of convention going, write short stories and get published and then write novels, industry is just dying, and the internet has just replaced what we used to think of as a science fiction culture.
Well, that's depressing, but you should still check out Douglas Lain's latest novel, Bash Bash Revolution. Douglas, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.